So, today on the podcast, we have the unusual story about how back in the 1950s, Walt explored a plan to bring airboats to Disneyland as a type of Tomorrowland attraction. The type of airboats that were then showing up in South Florida, boats with huge propellers and flat aluminum hulls that skimmed with futuristic elegance across the surface of the water. And as part of this, we also have the story of the person who oversaw that project, Rear Admiral Joe Fowler, with some of that information coming from the naval holdings at the National Archives. But before I get to that, I've got two quick things. First, I want to remind everyone that next week, as it's the weekend of the D23 event, our weekly episode will be pushed from Sunday to sometime early in the week, probably Monday night or maybe Tuesday. Simply, we're going to talk about announcements made at the D23 event on our next podcast, but we can't talk about them in our usual Sunday release slot if the event is still going on. We've done this in the past for some previous D23 expos, shifted the release date by a day or two, and we'll do that this time as well. I'll be at the event, then come home and record. So look for our next update early next week instead of on Sunday night. And more importantly, second, I need to thank another round of Bandcamp subscribers. I am deeply grateful for each listener who supports us over on Bandcamp. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without our Bandcamp subscribers, this show would simply cease to exist. So, today, thanks are going out to Calvin, Andy, Scott, and Emily. Thanks to each of you for supporting all we do here. And now we're going to spin back the clock of time to the 1950s for another entry in our Strange Stories series, to a time when Walt was still exploring what his park would be, with some early attractions falling away and other ideas just beginning to take shape, a story that I call Admiral Joe Fowler and the Airboats of Disneyland. There were many influences that shaped the original design of Disneyland. One impulse led Walt to arrange the park as a series of Hollywood backlot sets, such as the Western area, the Jungle area, and an area keyed to the turn of the century, perfect for a period drama. Much of this influence came through Disney artists such as Dick Irvine and Harper Goff, both of whom had been art directors on live-action films. Another influence was the rich landscape designs of Tivoli Gardens, which Walt visited in the 1950s. These elements were arranged into Disneyland through landscape architect Ruth Shellhorn, as well as plant and nursery specialists Jack and Bill Evans, the latter two having landscaped Walt's home at Holmby Hills. And the third tradition was to create a type of living museum of American transportation. This is probably the most underplayed element in the history of Disneyland. This influence was most deeply engaged during Walt's 1948 trip to the Chicago Railroad Fair, which celebrated 100 years of rail transportation and also featured many early automobiles, as well as a side trip to Greenfield Village on that same vacation, which featured, among other pieces of transportation history, an 1800s-style riverboat. These interests are best represented by three designers and engineers at WED. First, Roger Broggie, who had helped Walt create his backyard railroad, would largely oversee the development of the Disneyland steam trains. Next, Bob Gurr, who had studied automotive design and would oversee the development of many vehicles, including some antique reproductions, such as an omnibus on Main Street. And finally, a retired Rear Admiral named Joe Fowler, who would develop the ships. In terms of his eventual career at Disneyland, Joe Fowler is best remembered as the head of construction at Disneyland and also as the person who oversaw much of the development of Walt Disney World. But that's not how Fowler entered the company. Once there, he would quickly expand into the role of construction manager, but in 1954 he arrived on the Disneyland project because Walt needed someone with shipbuilding experience to help develop the Mark Twain steamboat, which was a larger and more elegant version of that paddle ship that Walt had seen on his trip in 1948 to Greenfield Village. Joe Fowler would later be credited as one of the key people who, after Walt Disney's death, oversaw the construction of Walt Disney World in Central Florida. But his life before joining Walt to contribute to Disneyland was different than any other key Disney employee in the 1950s. Fowler had absolutely no experience in movies, outdoor amusements, or any other kind of entertainment. If in early 1954, you were to place 9 random people in a row and then add in Fowler to make 10, and then ask onlookers to guess which of these 10 people would be a key contributor to Walt Disney's amusement park, I doubt that anyone there would ever guess of the 10, it would be Joe Fowler. Joe Fowler was born in Lewiston, Maine in 1894. Making him 1 year younger than Roy Disney and about 7 years older than Walt. In his younger days, Fowler responded to 2 names, both Joe and Bob, though the nickname of Bob would fall away long before he arrived at Disney. He was bright and excelled at school. He graduated from high school at the age of 16. Then he attended a small private college in his hometown before gaining entrance at the age of 20 to the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. I grew up on a farm in Maine, he said, and always wanted to go to the Naval Academy. At the academy, he was the captain of the crew team, a member of the football team, and the editor of the yearbook, which was called The Lucky Bag. He graduated 5th in his class out of 203 students. I graduated a year early on account of World War I. During the war, he worked on a number of ships, including the USS Columbia and the USS New Mexico. After the war, he went to graduate school to study engineering and naval architecture at MIT. I was appointed to MIT, he said, and there I had 3 years to complete my postgraduate course in naval architecture and engineering. Naval architecture is the basic design of ships, whether they are warships or civilian ships. It's a profession, somewhat allied with ordinary architecture, but a bit more complicated because in place of designing on a firm foundation, ships have a very unstable foundation in the rolling effects of the waves and so forth at sea. From there, his career was largely focused on overseeing the construction of new ships. I was fortunate enough to spend 5 years in China, he said, from 1924 to 1929, where I headed the design and the construction of 6 river gunboats, the Panay and her sisters. In the early 1930s, he worked in the design division in the Naval Shipyard in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I built the Saratoga and the Lexington. When I say I built, I mean I had charge of the design in Washington and surveying the construction of the work in the private shipyard, in this case at Newport News. I was, for 2 years, in 38 and 39, on the staff of the Commander Submarine Force U.S. Fleet, where I could observe at sea the operation of the submarines, note their problems, and get that input into the design of subsequent submarines. During World War II, he was stationed at Mare Island near San Francisco, where he was a commander in the construction corps overseeing the development and repair of ships for the war effort. On account of the impact of the large number of ships coming back for repairs or for battle, he said, damage work from the South Pacific, initially for Pearl Harbor, the Navy Department installed an office in San Francisco. The officer in charge of that had the responsibility for the allocation of all the Navy ships on the West Coast in all the shipyards, as well as coordinating administration in all those shipyards. Commander Fowler was good-natured yet firm. He told jokes. Most people tended to like him. During the later war years, he was in charge of 30 private shipyards in the Bay Area. For this, he received awards. For exceptionally meritorious conduct as assistant to the industrial manager, Navy Yard, Mare Island, California, during World War II, he received the Legion of Merit. In terms of his citation, it also read, responsible for the supervision of all naval work in the approximately 26 commercial shipyards on San Francisco Bay, Fowler rendered invaluable assistance in repairing ships within assigned availabilities and in maintaining the many units of our fleet in efficient operation. In addition to his regular duties, he served as an advisor to the commander, Western Sea Frontier, and as a member of the committee for allocating repair work for the entire West Coast, playing an important role in the overall program of ship maintenance and amassing a wealth of experience in operating these vital activities for the Navy. After the war, he worked briefly as the commanding officer of the Naval Dry Docks in Hunters Point, San Francisco. From there, still stationed in the Bay Area, he held the role of the Director of Defense. By this point, he was a key figure in the Navy. I used to report directly to Congress, he said. You see, to take back a report from me and make some recommendations to the facilities, and then I would report to the head of the Secretary of War or Secretary of Navy or whatnot in Washington. At times, his appointments in Washington, D.C. even exceeded those in Congress. The new Secretary of Defense asked me to go back to Washington to head up a group to eliminate all waste from the government, he said. 2.5 years I did that for Truman. He was very enthusiastic about this work crew. I used to meet with him one-on-one there about once a month. In this role, he hired the Stanford Research Institute to complete survey work on effective ship procedures. It was through this work, he said, that I knew the head of Stanford Research, a man named C.V. Wood. He did some work for me in the standardizing of specifications for guided missiles for all the services. This, too, would cut down waste in terms of training and equipment by having one set of unified procedures for all divisions of the military. C.V. Wood was a young, extremely ambitious man who during the war had overseen the production of military planes, including the Liberator bomber, for an aircraft manufacturer in Texas. He also faked his college degree in engineering, but that is an entirely different story, and for a while even claimed to have a PhD in economics, which few questioned because of his natural intelligence. During the 1940s and early 1950s, C.V. Wood could see that businesses related to military equipment would be a lucrative place to work. But he could also see that America would soon draw down on military purchases and focus on other industries such as automobiles, electronics, and leisure, which is how he came to Stanford Research. Fowler could see this as well. In 1952, he retired from the military with the rank of Rear Admiral. As a newly arrived civilian, he set about to building housing developments in the Bay Area, essentially suburban houses for the World War II generation who were just then starting families. It was a reasonable post-military career for someone with experience in architecture, engineering, and project management. But unbeknownst to Fowler, his career now was headed toward an extremely unusual turn, wholly due to the Stanford Research Institute team and C.V. Wood. In 1953, Stanford Research, including C.V. Wood, was hired by Walt Disney to create a site location survey and later a feasibility report for the creation of Disneyland. Wood would become so interested in this Disney project, or perhaps Wood could so deeply see the financial possibilities in the project that he would convince Roy Disney to hire him as the first president and essentially the business manager of Disneyland Incorporated. In that role, C.V. Wood helped Walt fill needed positions. As a mid-century outdoor amusement park, Disneyland was an unusual project with many unique influences. Disneyland would present Hollywood-style backlots arranged as themed lands. It would offer lush landscaping similar to European pleasure gardens such as Tivoli Gardens in Denmark, and perhaps most unusually, it would present both the history and future of American transportation embedded into themed areas around the park. For this aspect of the project, Walt already had Roger Broggie, along with a small team of machinists who could manage the creation of steam engines. Through an extremely fortuitous hire, he would soon have Bob Gurr, an auto body designer who would teach himself how to design and engineer antique automobiles and even a double-decker omnibus. But he had no one with deep experience in creating full-size ships, most importantly that triple-decker 19th century steamship he wanted to put on his river. In looking through possibilities for a person to oversee this project, C.V. Wood explained that on a previous assignment, when Stanford Research had been hired by the military, he had worked with a man with a master's degree in naval architecture who had spent decades constructing and repairing ships. He was also good with large projects. In all, Joe Fowler had overseen the construction of 29 ships for the military, including massive aircraft carriers, and he had also overseen the repairs of countless others. If he could oversee the creation of an aircraft carrier for the U.S. government, he should have little difficulty with a Mississippi paddle wheeler. Wood believed that Fowler still lived with his wife in or near San Francisco. For years, Fowler had lived on Lombard Street, not far from the Marina District and Fisherman's Wharf. But now he lived in Los Gatos, where he was building houses. At this time, Walt Disney and a few of his designers were making regular trips to the Bay Area, as this was the location of Aero Development, a ride manufacturer who was creating the ride vehicles and ride systems for many Disneyland attractions, including Mr. Toad, Snow White, Dumbo, Casey Jr., and the Spinning Teacups. The Bay Area was also the location of a few amusement parks that Walt's team explored as rough inspiration for the park they wanted to build. On an upcoming trip, it was proposed that Wood take Walt over to the house of Joe Fowler, but Walt wanted it to be a social visit so he could get a feel for this Rear Admiral without the meeting being perceived as a type of formal job interview. At this time, in the spring of 1954, Joe Fowler was 20 years older than the average employee at the Disney studio. To be exact, he was 59, soon to turn 60. Like many construction bosses of the era, he tended to dress in dark jackets, gray slacks, and white shirts. He wore black-rimmed eyeglasses and dark felt hats. By this point in his life, his face was comprised of soft, doughy features, which naturally conveyed sympathy. But on the construction site, he had a habit of watching workers from a distance, his hands placed in judgment on his hips, assuming the starchy posture of an admiral. His transition from building ships to building homes, as far as anyone could tell, was going well. That April, he received a call from his friend C.V. Wood to tell him about this strange new position he'd taken with a movie company to build, of all things, an amusement park with areas that resembled a studio backlot. Their conversation was peppered with one-liners, as both men were in the habit of memorizing jokes. But Fowler also found himself intrigued by this movie-inspired amusement park. C.V. Wood could be a good salesman, he knew, but this park interested him in a way he didn't fully understand. Its grandness, perhaps, the way it seemed so far from the military in World War II. Before hanging up, Woody promised to send him some information about the park, particularly about this steamboat, in case he wanted to visit it someday. At the end of the week, he received another call from C.V. Wood. "Joe, I'd like to come up and see you," he said. He would be traveling with a friend or two to inspect a narrow-gauge railroad and other midway rides for that same amusement park, with the trip arranged as general research for Disneyland. Wood was wondering if he and his friends might visit the Admiral, though he neglected to mention that one of his traveling companions would be Walt Disney himself. "Gee, Woody, that's great," Fowler said. "I'd be glad to see you." On the morning of Saturday, April 17th, Walt Disney, C.V. Wood, and another early park planner, Nat Weinkauf, boarded a plane headed to San Francisco. They met Fowler at his house in Los Gatos, which was really a small ranch where they talked briefly about Walt's amusement park before inspecting a locomotive at a nearby facility. When they returned, the Disney men shared a meal and some drinks with Fowler and his wife. Fowler talked about his years in the Navy, and in turn, Walt talked about his studio, how it resembled a college campus, and then he talked about his park, how he wanted it to be nothing like the noisy, dirty amusement parks one sees in most large cities. Initially, Walt talked about Disneyland in general terms. At one point, he even pointed to an impressive 40-foot olive tree just outside Fowler's house, saying, "Boy, I wish we could move that down to Anaheim." But gradually, he directed the conversation toward the Mark Twain steamboat, as he knew that Fowler, with his vast experience in shipyards, might be able to offer some specific advice for this project. Before stepping out the door, Walt shook Fowler's hand. "Joe," he said, "I'd like to have you come down next week and have a look at Disneyland. We'll send you a ticket." The offer was repeated by C.V. Wood. "I'd like to have you get the feel of the place," he said. Fowler didn't know how to respond. Later that night, he discussed the offer with his wife, understanding that Walt and C.V. Wood had vaguely suggested that he might work on the Disneyland project as a type of outside consultant, probably for that steamship they wanted to build. It was an unusual but intriguing proposition. From overseeing the construction of aircraft carriers built to traverse oceans to an ornate steamship designed to carry guests around a man-made river. "Well," he said, "I don't know anything about the motion picture business, but how do you turn down a personal invitation from Walt Disney?" As he fell asleep that night, he wondered what it would be like to be a consultant for a Hollywood movie studio. The idea seemed foreign yet alluring to the old Navy man. It was something he had never dreamt of. On the following Monday, before leaving, retired Rear Admiral Joe Fowler told his wife, "I don't know anything about the motion picture business. I'll be back tomorrow night." He placed his hat on his head, picked up his briefcase, then stepped out the door. He flew to Los Angeles with only a single change of clothes, and once there, he met Walt Disney's son-in-law, Ron Miller, and one of Woody's men, Fred Schumacher, who drove him to the Burbank studio. After a brief tour, Fowler spent a half hour with Walt in his office discussing the Disneyland project, as well as current films then in production. Walt showed Fowler some concept art for his park. In all likelihood, the artwork included multiple images of the Mark Twain steamship, and in return, Fowler explained how such a boat might be built. Their conversation wasn't limited to the steamship. It included other aspects of the park, but before their meeting concluded, Walt was called away to a screening room to watch the morning rushes. "I'll be gone for a few minutes," he said, "but help yourself to whatever you want." Pointing to the intercom, he said, "Push the button and get coffee." Their meeting was so pleasant that when Walt left the room, Fowler believed he would soon return, perhaps with other executives, to continue the interview. But when Walt didn't come back, Fowler walked over to Woody's office. The two men talked about the boat and other projects at Disneyland until Woody too was called away to an urgent meeting. Alone in the office, Fowler looked at some promotional artwork for Disneyland on Woody's desk. The painting appeared to be of the medieval castle, complete with flags and a drawbridge. He examined the intricacies of this building, the texture of the bricks, the shape of the windows, the way the scale of the structure had been altered to make the building appear taller than it actually was. Already, he sensed this consulting job might include other projects than simply the steamship. Clearly, Walt was looking for both someone to build the ship and also someone to work as a project manager, similar to overseeing the construction of houses. After a few minutes, he returned to Walt's empty office, but he was met by one of the studio secretaries. "Is your name Joe Fowler?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I'm here to show you to your office. There's some contractors waiting to talk to you." Fowler's face betrayed surprise. Only then did he realize the interview was over and he'd been offered a position. Exactly what the position would entail he didn't yet know. He took off his hat and ran his free hand over the smooth dome of his scalp. He stood there considering his options. Briefly, he looked out the window. Studio buildings as far as he could see. Then he let out a long, decisive sigh, believing he might at least talk to the man waiting for him. "Come with me," she said, handing him a thick envelope. "Here's the keys to a car." Without even discussing a consulting fee, he followed Walt's secretary down the hall to his new office, where he supposed he would meet these contractors. Though Fowler expected to stay in Los Angeles just for a day, he ended up staying there 3 weeks before returning home, talking to contractors and attempting to better understand Walt's vision for this entire park. Even in those early days, Fowler recognized Walt's great weakness. Walt surrounded himself with artists able to produce beautiful concepts of buildings and rides, but no one at the studio had a practical understanding of what it would take to build a 60-acre cinematic amusement park, especially one designed to accommodate millions of visitors each year. During these initial weeks, he shared many meals with Walt and Woody, who gradually made the amusement park seem more interesting than the highly profitable housing project he was already working on in the Bay Area. "Little by little, we got Fowler trapped into this thing," Walt later joked. "We got him so trapped," he said, "to hell with the subdivision." When asked for a job description, Walt told him, "Now, Joe, I'll create in my mind all the things we're going to do, and your job is to make engineering realities out of them." Though, as Fowler would soon discover, those engineering realities never came with a full set of plans, nor did they come with adequate funds. In practice, Fowler discovered that his job was to not only convert Walt's dreams into reality, but to secretly report those dreams to Roy Disney, thereby allowing Roy the opportunity to keep the park within its budget. At this point, our episode today might seem like any of our weekly podcast stories, the exploration of a Disney project through the perspective of the people who worked for Walt. There's nothing so far that would qualify it as a strange or unusual story, but that's coming now. When Disneyland opened, there were many boats. There was, of course, the Mark Twain, an enormous steamship whose substructure was created by a ship manufacturing firm in San Pedro, California, and whose 3-deck superstructure was built at the studio, with those pieces joined together under Fowler's supervision and floated on the Disneyland River. There was the Jungle Cruise boats, which back then were known as the Jungle River boats. There were the Storybook Land boats, which back in 1955 were called the Canal Boats of the World. And then there were some You Drive 'em boats out on the Tomorrowland Lagoon, roughly where the subs are now. These were the Tomorrowland boats, and also where the unusual part of our story today actually begins. The Tomorrowland boats were an opening day attraction at Disneyland. Think of them this way. They were designed to be like a water version of Autopia, where guests, at least initially, could pilot boats wherever they wanted. But they regularly broke down. At the end of the first summer, the boat attraction was closed. Decorative, space-aged fins were added to the back of the boats to make them look more futuristic, and they were reopened as the Tomorrowland Phantom Boats. As the Phantom Boats, a back seat was added to each vehicle so that a cast member could pilot 2 guests around the lagoon, which they hoped would limit how often the boats broke down. One young cast member recalled they weren't all that thrilling to ride. The boats were expensive to repair and expensive to operate, as they required 1 cast member for every 2 guests. Most everyone, including Joe Fowler, knew that there were deep problems with them. Problems so deep that they needed to be removed. There were certain things in the rush of getting a big attraction ready in 11 months that subsequently we took out, Fowler explained. The Phantom Boats was one of them. Oh boy, what trouble we had with that. Walt regularly considered new attractions proposed by both WED and Disneyland employees. One early idea was to replace the struggling Phantom Boats with airboats, like those that were then growing in popularity in the Everglades. In the early part of the century, airboats were largely manufactured overseas, primarily in France, but in the 1930s and the 1940s, airboats gained popularity in the States, largely around South Florida. Most of these boats were made for 2 people, a small aluminum body propelled by aircraft motors and tall propellers housed in protective cages, but a new type was arranged as a tour boat, capable of carrying a dozen or so guests. In California, airboats were exotic, something that most locals had never seen in person, and therefore suggested a type of rare and perhaps futuristic transportation. Almost surely Walt and his team had never seen a swamp-style airboat in person, but likely they'd seen them in film. A presentation on a screen where a few possible problems were easily masked. The tremendous sound of their engines, the backdraft of their propellers, and the way their movement whipped wind and spray onto areas around them. Today, airboat operators would use ear protection to muffle the sound, but this was not common, particularly when they are shown on TV or on film in the 1950s or even in the 1960s. Even the TV show Gentle Ben, produced in the mid-1960s, which featured the use of an airboat, showed its star Dennis Weaver piloting one without any ear protection. In terms of image presentation, this would make almost any viewer believe that their operation was far less noisy than it was in person. Walt was intrigued with this idea, something that would present an unusual and perhaps even futuristic type of water transportation in Tomorrowland, a boat that could move with speed around the island that was then in the center of the lagoon. This, everyone on the WED and Disneyland teams knew, was a job for the one person who deeply understood boats, their abilities, construction, and maintenance. This was the plan. Rear Admiral Joe Fowler would leave California on a Friday afternoon for a research trip in Florida. In a world before airlines primarily used jets, it would take Admiral Fowler a full day to reach Miami. He didn't arrive until Saturday afternoon, though on that day he also talked with a representative from the Everglades about how the boats worked in the national park. The following day, a Sunday, he tested a range of airboats, from those that held 2 people to the relatively new styles of touring airboats that held a dozen. He also talked to local operators and boat builders about how a boat like this might operate as a tourist attraction in a body of water that was 6 or 7 acres large. On Monday, he traveled back to the city and visited the Miami Shipbuilding Corporation in downtown Miami, not far from Brickell Island, where he explored the possibility of a slightly different type of watercraft, a hydrofoil and a hydrofoil arranged as an airboat. These hydrofoils, made by Miami Shipbuilding, had been initially developed for the Navy, though these designs were new to Fowler. These boats, he knew, were now available commercially, not just to the military. When at dock or moving slowly, the aluminum hulls of these boats sat on the water, but when brought up to 25 or 30 miles an hour, these boats lifted up on twin skis, rising above the water, along with a pair of feelers angled at the front of the boat to better stabilize the craft. They were often described as flying boats. Fowler talked to the person who had developed the technology and also held the patent, an Englishman named Christopher Hook. They quickly understood each other, two people who had spent their lives building unique boats. Hook was now living in Miami, so he could oversee production directly. Hook called his adaptation of the hydrofoil a hydrofin, an incredibly stable craft that could rise a foot or two above the water. Fowler, now deeply aware of the boat's limitations in an amusement park setting, asked if there was any way they might be arranged for Disneyland. He also acquired film of the boats in actions to take back to Walt. By this time, it was clear that there were two obvious issues with any of these boat options: the sound of the aircraft motors and the wind and spray produced by the propellers. But this did not immediately stop Fowler, especially as he had been sent there by Walt. To solve one of these concerns, Fowler explored how glass partitions might protect guests, shops, and food stands in Tomorrowland from wind and spray. Another problem was the sound, which also might be buffered by those same partitions. Yet another issue was the depth of the Tomorrowland lagoon. The small airboats tended to operate best in shallow bodies of water like a swamp. To create a hydrofoil that would work well in the Tomorrowland lagoon, the park would need to order a boat capable of holding about 15 or 20 people, which was a possibility. Boats such as these could be easily marketed as a type of water transportation of the future. But Fowler could see even then that these problems would be difficult to overcome. It was one of the many times now that Fowler would need to explain to Walt that he couldn't see any clear path towards using an idea such as this in his park. In the end, Disney decided to move away from the airboats. There was the noise, the air currents, and of course, the cost. Each airboat would need one, maybe two people to operate it, which meant that it would be another high labor cost attraction, though not nearly as high cost as the Phantom boats. Beyond this, a 12 and especially a 20-person airboat would likely look out of scale running next to the Autopia cars, which at most held two people. Most everything in Tomorrowland, from the Moonliner rocket to the Skyway gondolas to the Autopia cars, were built at a reduced scale, which meant that a 20-person airboat would stand out as a visual oddity, something oversized compared to all the attractions around it. After Fowler's trip to Florida, the Disney team moved away from the idea of an airboat or airboats on Tomorrowland Lagoon, as Bob Gurr recalled. Joe Fowler obviously didn't think that the proposed replacement of an airboat ride would have worked. Instead, Walt and his designers decided that the solution was to make a boat ride nearly identical to Autopia. Slow-moving motorboats hemmed in by underwater pipe rail guides, with each boat holding 2 or at most 3 people. Just as on Autopia, guests could steer a little to the left and a little to the right, but the underwater pipe rail guide system kept the boats moving forward on a predefined path. The ride would be called the Motorboat Cruise, which Fowler and Bob Gurr developed and oversaw its installation. They created paths for the boats in narrow channels and small open areas next to the big lagoon. The motorboat cruise opened in 1957, the year after the demise of the Phantom boats. These boats moved through waterways around another small-scale piece of transportation, a short-lived train called the Viewliner. But the exploration of an airboat as a type of futuristic piece of water transportation would be one of the bridges that eventually led to another futuristic water transportation actually being installed in Tomorrowland, the submarines, back when nuclear subs, along with their amazing underwater journeys, were regularly featured in the news. But for a brief while, there was a plan to include airboats on the Tomorrowland Lagoon, an unusual attraction, unlikely overseen by a Rear Admiral who used to build aircraft carriers, that would have given Tomorrowland a very different feel than the motorboat cruise and the submarines that eventually ended up there. Remember, next week our episode won't post on Sunday due to the D23 event in Anaheim. It will post either on Monday night or on Tuesday, but we will be here to explore what the announcements made at the event mean for the future of the Disney company. Also, most distribution outlets for our podcast, such as iTunes, also include a photographic cover that changes each week. The photo for this week's episode is of Joe Fowler overseeing the installation of the motorboat cruise at Disneyland in 1957. So before you go today, make sure to check that out. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you'll find well over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until sometime early next week, this is Todd James Pierce.